where I want to start is by saying simply this. Trust is important, but it's also dangerous. Trust is a relationship that exists between someone who trusts something and then that other thing. And when we talk about journalism, of course, this is really a relationship between the public and the question of whether the public trusts journalism, whether the public trusts the news that they can access. This relationship is dangerous. Why is it dangerous? It's dangerous because trust is an expression of unverified confidence. If we knew for certain that we could count on something, we didn't need to trust it. We knew. In that sense, trust is dangerous because if we trust something that we can't in fact count on, we're going to make mistakes. Things are not going to work out the way we had hoped. We will make decisions that turn out to be ill-informed. We will have counted on something we couldn't count on. In that sense, trust is dangerous. Of course, conversely, mistrust is also dangerous. If we do not trust something we could have trusted, we will be left worse off. We will not do things we could have done. We will not have availed ourselves of information we could have enjoyed. We will be less informed, less empowered than we could have been. So really, I think from a democratic point of view, we don't just want people to trust things willy-nilly. We don't want people to just trust all journalism or all news necessarily. Really what we want as a society is that we want people to trust things that are trustworthy and be skeptical of things that are not trustworthy. If we could please advance to the next slide. This is a quote from one of the most thoughtful pieces of work that I know of on the question of trust, delivered by the British philosopher Honora O'Neill, who in her Reith lectures given to the BBC writes about this issue of whether in fact we have this much talked about crisis of trust, or whether we have instead what she calls a culture of suspicion. I won't read through the whole slide, but I think it's worth just pondering for a moment whether when we talk of a crisis of trust, who is it really a crisis for? So most of the time, when I talk to journalists or publishers or media organizations, or for that matter, politicians, what they really mean by a crisis of trust is that they assert, I am trustworthy and people should trust me. But the question, I think, is whether the public in fact feels that this is so. So if we could advance to the next slide, please. I will run through some of our evidence on what this looks like from the point of view of the other side of this relationship, from the point of view of the public. So if we can advance to the next slide, please. This is just an overview. There is something missing from this slide. Of the research from our digital news report where we survey media users in 38 different countries around the world. The missing part here is that the trust in news that I use is just 49% this year. Less than half of internet news users across the world trust the news that they use themselves. Trust in other news more generally is lower at 42%, and trust in news in search and trust in news in social are lower still. So we live in this environment where even the news that people rely on, they often say that they don't feel that they can trust. If we could please advance to the next slide. Of course, there are big national differences here. In some countries, often in Northern Europe, we have very high levels of trust. More than the majority of the population feel they can trust most news most of the time. But then there are other countries, including France, where this year just 24% of our respondents say that they felt they could trust most news most of the time. And in France, the percentage who say that has dropped by 11 percentage points since last year, of course, in part driven by the protests and the attacks on the press by some populist politicians, but also parts of the public that felt the press and the media more generally didn't reflect their views, their values, or took their issues seriously. Could you please advance to the next slide? Trust, of course, is not just about overall levels of trust in news in general, but also trust about individual brands. So this is just some data from the United States to illustrate how varied this can be. These are news brands in the United States ranked by the trust in the broad public on a scale from 0 to 10. And what we see is a pattern we can recognize from many different countries around the world. It's one in which broadly used and largely impartial or politically unpartisan news sites are broadly trusted. In the case of the United States, it's primarily local television, to some extent the main national broadcast television networks, to some extent upmarket newspapers, though less so. And then you have digital-born brands with a shorter history, being less trusted. Trust accumulates over time. And partisan sites, often very trusted by their users, but not trusted by the public at large. If we would advance to the next slide, please. We tried to dig in through a number of focus groups into the factors that may drive trust. So we essentially asked groups of citizens about what are the things that might make you more likely to trust a news provider. And I think as we can all recognize from our own life, this is very complicated. There are many different factors that might make us more liable to trust someone, to take that leap of faith, to have that unverified confidence in someone. And there are many different things here, but I think we can try to sort of broadly categorize them into a couple of different important clusters here. If you could please advance. First, we have editorial practices, right? The journalism itself matters, and people's perception of the journalism itself matters. Things like accuracy, the perception that people are not biased, that they try to be transparent, that they try to be fact-based in their reporting. But there is more that matters than just editorial practices. Please advance one more. There are questions of principles, right? Not just what do you do, but what are you for? How do the public see questions of your authenticity, your sincerity, your integrity, your honesty, what you are about, the principles, potentially political principles that inform your journalism? If we could advance one more. And there are also issues about us as members of the public, right? Questions of identity and collective identity. Things like familiarity. Do I know who you are? Have I learned something about you over time? Things like recommendation. Do my friends like you? Do my friends trust you? Things like an inheritance, if you will, or family history. You know, did my parents trust you? Did my parents recommend that I rely on you? So these are some of the many different drivers of trust. And if we advance one slide, please. We can see how powerfully the question of principles and identities informs people's trust in the media. If we look at this data from the United States and developments in trust in the media since the election of Donald Trump in 2016. So before that, during the tail end of the Barack Obama presidency, there was a gap in trust between Americans identify as the political right, that's the red line, and Americans identify as being on the political left, that's the blue line. But after the election of Donald Trump, we see this huge growth in trust amongst liberals and a decline over time, quite precipitous decline over time amongst people on the right, conservatives. Now, I would put to you that this cannot be explained by the editorial practices of American newsrooms. I think we can only understand this development by reference to people's perceptions of the principles of the press and of the identities that people bring with them as they engage with news, right? So you can imagine a world in which liberals all of a sudden trusted the news more because they believed that the news as an institution was committed to principle that made it a check on the power of a president that liberals did not like. And similarly, you can see conservatives over time coming to hold the view that, again, it wasn't so much about editorial practices changing in American newsrooms, but more that they saw the press as being adversarial, antagonistic, oppositional to a president that they liked. Can we please advance one slide? But of course, this goes well beyond trust. It's also about whether people see journalism and news as valuable. So in the same survey this year, we asked people a set of questions about the way in which they value journalism. 62% of our respondents say that they feel the news does a good job of keeping them up to date. That's a good starting point. That's part of what journalism aspires to do. Just 51% of our respondents say that news media help me understand the news of the day. 51%. Just barely half of our respondents believe that the news help them understand things. And just 42% say the news media monitor and scrutinize powerful people and businesses. Less than half of our respondents believe that journalism tries to hold power to account. On the basis of that, very uneven trust, mixed perceptions of the actual value of journalism, I think it's not a surprise when we turn to the question of whether people in fact pay attention to journalism. The more competitive the media landscape is, the less attention they pay to journalism that they have pretty mixed feelings about. If we could please advance one. So if you look at, could we please advance one? One more, please. If you look at print, the least competitive, if you will, of the media platforms we access, about 20% of the time that people spent with print media estimated is spent with news. If you could advance one, please. Radio, more competitive, slightly newer medium. 16% of the time we spent with radio is spent with news, in the US and the UK at least. Advance one more, please. TV, more competitive still. About 12% of the time we spent with TV, spent with news. Advance one more. Digital, far more competitive still, 7%, and this is a high estimate. Comscore, the analytics companies, suggest that it's just 3% of the time that people spend with online media is spent with all news and information providers combined. If we could advance one slide, please. So, if this is the backdrop, this sort of generalized skepticism where people don't really trust the news, not even the news they rely on, and certainly don't trust the news they come across in search and social, and have many brands they have very low opinions of and actually aren't all that impressed with the value of journalism from their point of view always. How are journalists and others trying to address these issues around trust? If you could advance one, please. I think we can see one cluster of responses that essentially are around trying to address the issue of whether machines can help people find more trustworthy information and thus over time help rebuild their trust in news and journalism. So this starts from the recognition that increasingly more and more of the news that we come across is filtered by algorithms, ranking algorithms from companies like Google and Facebook and others that make display decisions when people search for things, when people open social media apps and the like. And if we want to make sure that people will trust the news and information they find via these increasingly important interfaces, we have to make sure that the ranking algorithms can in fact reward trustworthy journalism. So we have a set of different initiatives in this space, the Journalism Trust Initiative led by Reporters Without Borders and a coalition working out of Paris, the Credibility Coalition, the Trust Project, and a company like NewsGuard are all different examples of initiatives to try to develop machine-readable signals for trustworthy news with the ambition that over time this may help rebuild trust in news and journalism. Can we please advance one slide? Then you have another set of initiatives that are essentially around editorial practices, right? If people value transparency, if people want to know that journalists and news organizations have done their homework and in fact merit being trusted, that they are trustworthy when they claim to be so, you can look at initiatives like Document Cloud, Data Wrapper, and Muckrock, and others that are examples of journalists and news organizations trying to show their homework, trying to show we are not just people mouthing off on the internet. You know, we did research, we reported this, we looked up the primary sources, that's why you should trust us, and here's how you can check us if you don't. Can we advance one slide, please? And then we can think of a set of initiatives that are around relations, right? This is a recognition that if trust is a relationship, and if journalism exists in the context of its audience, rebuilding trust, renewing trust, reinforcing trust, and gaining attention is about taking that relationship seriously. And these are different initiatives from Ground Source over Hearken to the Coral Project that are all different ways in which journalists are working with technologists and others to rethink the relationship that journalism has with this audience, take that more seriously, invest more in that, in the belief that this over time will help rebuild trust. Can we please advance one slide? So we have people working on editorial practices. Can we advance one more, please? And one more. But political principles and collective identities continue to matter, right? Trust is a relation. Trust is a relation. We have to take these relationships seriously. We have to take the principles that people perceive us to have seriously, as well as their principles. Can we please advance one slide? So trust in news is about what we do. We have to gauge the fundamentals right. The promise of journalism is timeless, to seek truth and report it, and this is the bedrock of professional practice. It's the basis from which we can build a trusting relationship with the audience. Please advance one. But it's also about who we do it for. It's about this relationship with the public and parts of the public. It's about who these people are. It's about their principles. It's about their identities as well. Please advance one. And we do get to choose to be trustworthy in a professional sense. Journalists and news organizations can make sure that they do their homework, that they do proper reporting. Please advance one. But because trust is relational, we don't get to be trusted on that basis alone. Editorial practices matter, but they are not the only things that matter. For that, we have to connect and demonstrate what we believe in and who we are for. Can we please advance one? And this is the question, I suppose, for those of us in the room who care about journalism, whether we are journalists, reporters, editors, or others, is what have we done to do that? Thank you very much.